I am a geek of the ocean.
I am a voice for the ocean.
I am constantly amazed by the ocean.
I am deeply moved by the ocean.
I am mesmerized by the ocean.
I am humbled in the presence of the ocean.
I am extremely protective of the ocean.
I am highly concerned for the ocean.
I am a defender of the ocean.
I am a guardian of the ocean.
I am a diehard supporter of the ocean.
I'm a fighter for the ocean.
I'm truly appreciative of the ocean every moment of every day.
I'm an advocate for all the animals in the ocean.
I am truly grateful for the ocean.
I am here to protect the future of the ocean.
We're all connected to the ocean. Let's be ocean wise.
Yeah, there we go. Just the escape button. Okay, so I've got a few things a few housekeeping things to let you know about that you might be interested in. So the first one is we are having an after-hours event on April the 20th, and it's going to be a really fun night of trivia, true or fish. So yeah, that's happening on April 20th. If you are interested, go on the Vancouver Aquarium website, check it out, and I definitely recommend it. It's a very fun night. Oh, secondly, if you've been here before, you've already heard me talk about this, but just we have now a podcast. So if you're interested in podcasts, sorry about this, the mic's died. Anyway, we're going to have a scientist from the microplastics team here at Oceanwise. So much for the head mic. Anyway, we're going to have a scientist from the microplastics research team to tell you about some work that she is doing investigating ocean plastics. So, something has happened. Oh, and also, again, thank you for coming, and I just want to say that this event is free. We put this on free so we can make it as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, but that doesn't mean that it's actually free. So it does cost us a bit of money to put these events on. So if you appreciate them and have a couple of spare loonies in your pocket, there's a donation box outside. Anything you give will be really helpful in allowing us to keep going with these events. So yeah, now we're going to get started. So this month I decided that I would give the lecture. So I am the public programs manager here at the Aquarium at Oceanwise, and I started in September, so I thought I would give some of the knowledge of some of the things that I've learned in my prior life as a PhD student. I'm just going to get a stand for this mic. Can't hold the mic for an hour. Sorry about that. All right, try again. Mics. Yeah. Is that better? Really, the mic, I have a loud enough voice. The mic's for the live streaming. So I'm telling you today about how to tell good climate science from bad. So the aim of the lecture today is that basically, like, assuming that you don't really know anything about climate science, how you can assess a piece of information to tell whether you should trust it or whether you should mistrust it. So why is this important? So first of all, it's really important that we know what we're doing. So we know that we're making a situation. Wait a minute. Right, try from here, because I've got to see the. It's actually quite hard to look at this massive screen from here, so I'll look at the computer. Okay, so what we need to know whether what we're doing is actually going to help the situation, and actually going to, all the effort we are making to reduce our climate footprint is actually doing good, and is not potentially making the situation worse. So here we have the example of, so here we have the example, of assessing the science behind wind farms, perhaps, and hydroelectric power, for example. And also, it's important that we're able to assess this because we're bombarded continually with some potentially very contradictory facts all the time. So here's just some examples of some of the things that I've picked out from various newspapers and news sources. So you can see that we have some information that we know, for example, is not true. And so here's a bit of a fun example here. So I got this from the Daily Mail online. So this was published on April. And so this is an article saying that fracking causes as much seismic activity as jumping off a ladder. Basically, the study says that it's very unlikely that the earthquakes will be bad enough that we would actually feel them from fracking. And then I found another article just a couple of months later, so you can see here in July, that said the exact opposite. It says that fracking could lead to an earthquake domino effect. So, the same newspaper, 3 months apart, how are you supposed to assess what is actually going on here, basically? And also, things can be counterintuitive. So there's plenty of examples that I could regale you with, but I'll tell you about one. So this is the study here. You can see at the bottom. Well, so this study was done assessing the best method in which to get to encourage parents to pick their children up on time from daycare. So obviously, if the parents come to pick up their children from daycare at late, then it costs the daycare money. It inconveniences the staff. So one of the things they tried was charging parents a few dollars if they picked up their daughters or their sons and daughters late from daycare. And actually, the effect that this had was that it increased the number of parents who'd come to pick up their sons and daughters late from daycare. And so they think this is because it shifted the paradigm, and parents were thinking that, oh, it's fine if I'm late because I'll just pay them. And it made it a monetary transaction. So this is one example of situations in which you may think something, is common sense, but it is not the case. So also, I'm very keen to talk to you about this today because I've had experience. Well, so I've completed my PhD, so I completed that in UBC in August 2017, so just a few months ago. But while I was studying, I became very aware of the necessity for scientists to communicate their knowledge to non-scientists. And so with that in mind, I worked as an executive coordinator for Let's Talk Science for a few years. So that's a science outreach organisation. So I spent time going to schools and talking to young people, trying to get them enthusiastic about science and not to switch off. Whoops. And not to switch off. And because I I think this is so vitally important. I've now come to work at OceanWise as public programs manager. So my entire job now is engaging the public and putting on events and getting everybody enthusiastic about science, wanting to conserve the ocean and just become, say, more engaged citizens. And also, so obviously, I've had experience doing science. So this is a photo of me here. My thesis was, I was looking at a species of spider, social spider, and looking at their behavior. So this is a picture of me collecting some data in Ecuador in South America. And so this data, therefore, became an academic paper. And so this particular paper then went on to some news outlets, which then communicated my science. So this is a very interesting experience for me because, so obviously I've done all the science, and then in order to get to these points of being interviewed by a journalist, I got trained by UBC Media people, and the dichotomy between my collaborators, my scientific collaborators, and what they were saying, what they wanted me to talk about versus the UBC Media and how they wanted me to communicate, to the news outlets. There was a slight bit of conflict because the scientists, talk one language, and that isn't always necessarily what people is the best way to communicate with people who aren't scientists. So I use a bit of an analogy here. So I'm from the UK and I moved here about 7 years ago. And when I first moved here, I joined a softball team. But in the UK, we don't have baseball or softball. It's not a thing. I didn't know anything about it. So I remember, I think it was one of my first or second games when I was batting. My coach made some signals at me, rubbed her arm, and I don't know what it was, they're baseball signals. And when I said to her, I don't know what that means, what does it mean? Oh, well, it means that if there's a pop fly, then you've got to try and steal third base. I was like, okay, I don't know what pop fly is, what does that mean? Steal third base? Do you want me to run off with the base? I had a vision of me grabbing the base and running across the field. And so because I wasn't at all, I didn't know anything about this language to me was completely foreign. But obviously the concepts themselves aren't particularly complicated, and I feel that's a good analogy for scientists. They've worked for a long time within a particular field. They use language which is very utilitarian and very good for communicating with other scientists. But just because you perhaps don't know the particular words, perhaps when lay people don't understand exactly what the scientists are saying, it's only really because they're using language that you perhaps don't know. So the best thing is really just to ask and to learn and to impress upon some of the scientists that not everybody knows everything. So that's a good start. So what we're going to do, I'm going to talk about today is how to tell good science from bad. So I've come up with here 6 steps that you can work through when you're looking at a piece of news to see whether it's likely to be good science or bad science. So I'll run through all of these. And also, I'm a bit of a geek and I quite like coding, so I've created on my website, my own personal website, what I've called a good science game, because it's fun. So just if you want, I've got it here. And so this particularly, it runs, you can click on it, decide what you want to do and run through it. So you can maybe work along with that if you so fancy. Oh, so next one. So my very first step is probably quite a simple one. Is it important? Do you care? So I put this in because it can take sometimes a little bit of time maybe to try to figure the situation out. And if it's not important, well, just don't bother. Just, I don't know, do something else. Have a beer, watch a bit of TV. So here's an example of something that I think, nah, I don't really care. So this is from the UK. It's probably not a good thing that the British Environment Agency only has 2 electric cars, but nah, it doesn't really matter. So, going on to step 2, is understanding our biases. So this is particularly important because we all have biases, but it's important that we kind of understand them and take them into account when we're assessing information. So here's a little bit of an example here. So a bat and ball costs $1.10. A bat costs $1 more than a ball. How much does a ball cost? So I'm going to maybe have a little bit of a show of hands. How many of you thought it was 10 cents? Most, yeah, quite a lot of people. So in actual fact, if you think it's 10 cents, then that would mean that a bat would cost $1.10 and the total would be $1.20. So this is a good example because the answer comes to you really quickly, but in fact it's wrong. The real answer is actually 5 cents. But it'd be discouraged. So this study test has been done on loads of individuals. So for example, over 50% of students that tested from MIT, Harvard, and Stanford got this answer wrong. So this is an example of a brain shortcut. So so the brain, you can kind of think of it as like it has 2 systems. So it has a system 1 and a system 2. So this comes from this absolutely incredibly amazing book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you ever fancy something to read, definitely read that. If a book's ever changed my life, this one has. It really allows you to kind of understand what you and everybody else does. Anyway, so he posits that the brain is split off into 2 systems, system 1 and system 2. So system 1 is fast, unconscious, automatic, and just kind of makes everyday decisions. So it was your system 1 that came up with the answer 10 cents for that one. And system 2 is slow, it's conscious, it's effortful, and it uses more energy. So for those of you, we all thought, well, I'm pretty sure that nearly everybody thought 10 cents, but if you stop and think, oh, wait a minute, and then you do the calculations, you come up with the 5 cents. So it's your system 2 stopping and slowly doing the calculation. And so the next question might be is why does the brain have these shortcuts? Oops. So just, human beings evolved in a very different environment to the one that we find ourselves today. Like on the plains of Africa, and relatively, like evolutionarily, a short time ago, a very short time. So we're basically still have the brains of the individuals that evolved on the African plain. And food in that point was scarce. You wouldn't want to waste food. You wouldn't want to waste energy. And those individuals that were more successful at conserving energy were more likely to survive. So therefore, we evolved, to be as lazy as possible. And our brains actually use a lot of energy. So anything that allowed our brains to use a little bit less energy was something that was selected for. So some of the biases. So one of the ones is our brains. This is actually very interesting because it's a study that's been studied a lot. There's plenty of studies that have demonstrated that when we first given a bit of information, we process it as true, and then you kind of almost think that our system 1 processes it as true, and then it's your system 2 that then has to decide whether or not it's true or false. So an example of that for me, very recently, I was watching a very interesting documentary on Netflix, and I was completely swept up in it. And at the end of it, I was like, "Oh, that's terrible." I was thinking, and then suddenly I stopped and I thought, "Wait a minute! I've just completely taken this all to be true, and I know that the way they film things, what parts they choose to put in, what parts they choose to take out, all goes towards the agenda of the documentary." And I thought, "Oh, wait a minute! It might not actually be true." So we all fall for this. So what I want to impress upon everybody is try to do this instead. Instead of being the believe cat, be this awesome what cat. So whenever you come across some information or somebody tells you something, try and just think, ooh, what? Rather than believing it automatically. And so another of the biases that we can think about, I'm sure probably quite a few of you maybe have heard of this one, is the confirmation bias. And again, this comes from Daniel Kahneman's fantastic book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So this tends to be, so you can think of it as the horse with blinkers on. So you are much more likely to believe things that you kind of already believe. And process information in such a way that confirms what you already hold to be true. So an example of a study done during the 2014 presidential election in the States. They got some people who were Democrats and people who were Republicans, and they gave them a statement that they said was from either from the presidential candidate that they supported or the presidential candidate that they opposed. And it was a fairly ambiguous statement. And so then afterwards, they asked the individuals what they thought of this statement. So obviously, the people who got the statement and said it was from the candidate that they preferred were much more likely to say that this was a fantastic statement, that they thought it was, it confirmed what they already thought was true, whereas the individuals that were told that it was from the candidate that they did not support were much more critical of the statement, even if it was the same statement all the way through. And so again, this is something that has been confirmed in study after study. So just be very careful about this. And so let's see if we have, so I've got a couple of examples. So just kind of think how you process this when you first read it. So organic food is better for the heart versus organic food is actually not any healthier. So if you're more disposed to believe that organic food is better for the heart, you probably process that faster and then think, oh yeah, that's true. Whereas if you, if you do believe that if you do think organic food might be good for you and process this, you're probably more likely to dismiss it. So, and then the other one is a zero risk bias. So we're just not very good at processing risk as human beings. And on top of that, we also want to avoid risk, especially if the risk is associated with threat. So in the context of climate change coverage, the individuals who, such as scientists, have a fairly good understanding of risk and will communicate the science more accurately, whereas the individuals that want to persuade you of something that is perhaps false can mislead you by being certain. So when you are assessing whether something is true or false, just because one person appears to be less sure than another person doesn't necessarily mean that one is more true than the other. You can be really, really, really sure of something that is not true. So I've noticed this a fair bit on news programs, for example, so just bear that in mind. And especially with scientists, because scientists were trained. I've been trained from the day when I was 18 and I went to university to study science, that you never ever say that is true. So that definitely caused that. The language is kind of just hedged, not because we don't believe it's true, just because it is kind of true. If you look at probability overall, there's always the possibility of some other thing being true. So scientists, when they talk to the public, will also talk like that and will say, yeah, it's probably very likely that CO2 is causing global warming. Whereas, as scientists go, we know it's true. It's just, going back to the baseball example, it's just a different way of talking. So, step 2. So step 2 conclusion, this cat. I just do love this cat. Just remember, if you're given any information or told anything, maybe picture this cat and go, what? And then that will be a good step towards being able to assess science in a more objective way. So step 3 is, what do the numbers actually mean? So if you're actually given some numbers, it's very important that you actually put these numbers in context. So I've got some examples here. So this is from the New Scientist from the end of last month. I'm really just because I was having to be reading the New Scientist as I was doing this presentation. But so just an example. So here we have one that says the clothing industry creates carbon emissions of 1.2 billion tons. So first of all, that doesn't actually mean anything. 1.2 billion tons per year, per month, per day. So to be fair to the New Scientist, they did say 1.2 billion tons a year. So we have, we know it's per year, but still, if I changed it to 1.2 million tons instead of billions, does that mean anything to you? Like, it's such a big number, we didn't really know anything. It doesn't mean a whole lot. So try and put it in context. So I've, went on Wikipedia and found out that overall the world emits 36 billion tons of carbon per year. So, doing a little bit of quick calculation, we can therefore see that actually the clothing industry creates 3.3% of all global carbon emissions. So by doing that, as an example, we can see that we've put it in context, that it maybe means a little bit more. So this is something that you've got to think about, because they quite often throw large numbers at you. And without putting them in context, we just don't really know what they mean. It might sound large, but maybe it's not large overall. So, when you hear somebody saying on the news or on the radio or on Facebook some large number, the first thing you've got to think is, what is that actually a large number? But we can go the reverse as well. So we have here, again, because I was reading the New Scientist at lunchtime, France will let its wolf population grow by 40%. So that sounds like a lot, 40%? That's a lot. But there's only currently 360 wolves in France. So an increase of 40% is 140 more wolves. So you put it in context the other way and think, even if it's a large relative increase, if you had a small number to begin with, it's not that big. And so another one, this is from a report done by some individuals in, I think it's the University of Lincoln in Australia, well, in New Zealand. So 688 kilograms of CO2 is released for each ton of New Zealand lamb for sale in Britain. So, okay. But compare that to 2,849 kilograms of CO2 released for each ton of New Zealand lamb imported into Britain. So in this case, you want to put it in context by comparing it to what we're interested in. So yeah, I find this extremely. So the reason, a bit of a side thing, that they thought that this is potentially the case is because it's much less energy intensive to raise lamb in New Zealand compared to the UK. And so if they put the lamb on ships, it doesn't compensate for all the extra energy that has to go into raising lamb in the UK. So again, put the numbers in context. So here's another one. So this book here, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. I found this in the local library just down the road from here. So he has some extremely interesting graphs. So the whole book, this book he's talking about why we should use fossil fuels. So no, here's a graph, an example of one of the graphs that he has in this. So it is here, 1,000, it's basically the rise of fossil fuel use since 1990. So the next thing is, but why has he put these massive spaces in the graph? So just as much as it's possible to give you numbers out of context so that you could think they're large or small, it's also possible to create graphs and figures that can appear to make things seem big increases or small increases by how they graph them. So we have this massive space, both here at the top and here, that you just don't need. And so I'm assuming that he did this to make it seem that the fossil fuel use since 1990 hasn't increased all that much. It does look relatively flat, I suppose, but I redrew the graph. And here we go. So this is the graph redrawn with much more sensible axes, and you can see that there is quite an increase, and then the cat's been replaced by one that's much more like, phew. It makes sense now. So just bear that in mind as well when you see graphs and figures, that how they graph them can also skew what the picture looks like. So in conclusion, remember when you have any numbers or figures that you put them in context. So step number 4, is there a correlation? So before we get started, just let you know, make sure that we all know what a correlation is. So it's quite simple. Whoops. It's either one thing increases with another, or one thing decreases as another one increases. I'm sure you've all heard this before, but I've seen this so many times still. Remember that correlation does not mean causation. So here's some examples. So of this one is particularly funny. So this guy here, his website, you can see it down here, tylervegan.com. Yeah. He has the best website ever because he's just found a load of things and then he's correlated them with each other. So this example in particular is he's found that the divorce rates in Maine correlates very closely with the per capita consumption of margarine. And you can see it's really a close correlation. So in this example, it's just random. He's just looked through a lot of things and found that just by chance, these two correlate very closely. So again, correlation does not mean causation. And I'm saying this again and again because I see this all the time where things are, just because they happen to increase or decrease with each other, they're said that one's caused the other. And this is, it takes quite a lot of evidence to demonstrate that one has caused the other. So to give you a little bit of an example, imagine we took some of you individuals, say for example in this audience. So I wanted to investigate whether individuals with red hair or without red hair varied in their height. So you can imagine it would probably be likely that individuals with red hair overall were taller than individuals without red hair. So if I was just going to take it at face value, I could say that red hair causes you to grow taller. But we kind of know that doesn't make any sense. So probably the most likely explanation would be that individuals with red hair come from perhaps like Scandinavian countries, and in Scandinavian countries and Northern European countries, they just tend to be much taller, or they tend to be a little bit taller, and therefore people with red hair happen to be taller. Red hair does not cause an individual to be taller. So this is just a little bit of a toy example, but here's another example of how something that's not being measured is actually causing the correlation. So this is one of my favorite examples. This isn't climate change related, but I do quite like it. So it was 1999, and I remember this in the UK. Everybody was kind of freaking out, because a study came out that said that parents who had night lights in their bedroom, in their children's bedroom, caused their children to have poor eyesight as they grew. So there were lots of people, it was on the news, and parents were turning off lights in their children's bedrooms. But remember, correlation does not mean causation. What turned out to be the case was actually the parents who had the lights on happened to be short-sighted. So because they were short-sighted, they had a light on in the bedroom because they couldn't see very well, so they had a light on. And short-sightedness is hereditary. It's passed on to their children, so their children therefore grew up to be short-sighted as well. So it had absolutely nothing to do with the light on in the bedroom. It was, in fact, just simple hereditary condition that was passed on to their children. So luckily it's not too bad a thing. Having lights on or lights off is not that bad. But that's just a quick example. So going back to this book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, in this figure, the author has shown that what he thinks is a cause, that the increase in fossil fuels since the 1990s has caused a decrease in tuberculosis. So, yeah, back to the cat. What? That doesn't make any sense. We can think of all sorts of reasons. As countries develop and they get better health systems, and as you develop, you just happen to have more fossil fuels. I'm pretty sure that burning more oil does not cure tuberculosis. So that's another example of causation does not mean correlation. So again, in conclusion, be very cautious when you're presented with one thing has caused another. It takes a substantial amount of evidence to demonstrate this, so always be skeptical. So step number 5, is it a prediction? So this is particularly salient within climate change research, because obviously a lot of the research is looking at predicting what's going to happen in the future and how the Earth will change and the climate will change in the years to come. So there's maybe 3 things you've got to think about if someone is predicting the future. Is it someone's guess or opinion? Is it if trends continue, which is extrapolation? Or is it a computer model? So starting with guess or opinion, probably not science. Someone just reckons something will happen. And I mean, even if people are relatively knowledgeable and predict things, it quite often doesn't come true. So they've shown this a lot with political pundits, for example. They know a lot about currently what's going on, but their predictions overall are not any better than lay people. People are just, without rigorous methods, people are very bad at predicting the future. Next one is if trends continue. So you see this a lot, and you'll start spotting this all the time. So this is an example of a recent article. If trends continue, by the year 2050, America will have 15% fewer plants. So what this is doing is it's looking at a trend over a certain number of years in the past and literally just drawing the line to keep it going. It's extrapolating it, assuming that nothing is going to change. But in the majority of cases, as things change, as things increase or decrease, things will change. So in this case, for example, we could imagine that there might be conservation efforts that will decrease, that will try to preserve plants. They might start planting plants, and therefore that would adjust, that would change what happens in the future. And so a lot of this happens as well with predictions of the human population in future years. But obviously, you know, as countries become more populous, as there's more individuals within the country, then the birth rate decreases. So if trends continue, is a bit dodgy. It's not something that you want to take as will be the future. But with climate change, the majority of well-done predictions are done by computer model. So how do computer models actually work? How do they predict the future? So they'll have a representation of the world. So they'll come up with the systems and the processes that the climate scientist thinks are important, and then they'll basically make that into a bunch of equations, which they'll then, so a bunch of equations plus some uncertainty. So the uncertainty goes into the model because everything's inherently a little bit uncertain. You want to make sure that you include that within the model so you can see what will happen, and then all of that goes into a computer, and what you get out is something like this. So this is an example of a computer model that was looking at how the sea ice will change over the next few years. So let me play this.
Then, around 1990, things start to change, and we start to see greater summer losses of the ice cover. By 2100, the Arctic in September is essentially ice-free in these simulations. We're not predicting the exact year at which this happens, but our simulation shows just how quickly summertime ice cover could disappear in the next 50 to 100 years.
So you can see from that they simulated how the ice will decrease.
So why do we care?
So also what they do as well is they will run the model multiple times with multiple different conditions. So, for example, they quite often have different conditions as to how the world will decrease or increase climate emissions as the time goes on. So they can see, if we stuck to the Paris climate accords and what the Earth will look like in 50 years, if we increase fossil fuel emissions, what will happen then? So when you'll see, perhaps you might see a graph of a climate model, and they'll have lots of different lines. Those would be different conditions that they put into their computer model. So the next step is also obviously an important one. Who said it? So first of all, the most important thing is to try to find the original source. Sometimes this can be very easy, but sometimes it can be surprisingly difficult, because quite often people don't put their sources, and so you can't quite find out what it is. But if you can, so here's an example. So who said it? So you have, I've given these options. So we have a peer-reviewed paper, NGO or government report, so like a non-profit organisation who's produced a report, for example. People, so and obviously a newspaper, website, or other if they haven't attributed what they're saying to a person or any other source. So just vaguely, we can kind of think in general that a peer-reviewed paper here is the most reliable, all the way down to newspaper, website, social media post. So let's talk a little bit about peer-reviewed studies. So first of all, I guess you might be asking, what is a peer-reviewed study? So I'll use here me as an example. So this is me doing my PhD, collecting spiders in the jungle and doing my behavioural analysis. So after I've come back from the jungle, I spent quite a lot of time doing statistics on the data that I collected and writing a paper. And then I sent this paper off to a journal editor. And then the journal editor sends the paper out to anonymous reviewers. So the reviewers know who I am, but I don't know who the reviewers are. So then I'll get back comments from the reviewers. And it will say, anonymous reviewer 1 said this, anonymous reviewer 2 said that. So I look through all their comments, make changes that they've suggested. So I'll do all the corrections. Send it back to the journal editor, who, if he's satisfied with the corrections, the article gets published. And important as well is these anonymous reviewers are individuals that work in your field. So they know your study system quite well as well. So we want to find the original source if you can. And so if it says something along these signs, along this, like this, is it like according to researchers at Stanford University, according to scientists, it would in general come from a peer-reviewed study. So this one is the one that I popped up earlier. Organic food is not any healthier. So I wanted to find out where this originally came from. So obviously, on news websites, they don't put the original sources, but a very quick bit of Googling, you can find it out. So I simply Googled Stanford University Organic Health. And then also, another hint is the date that the study was reported. So the way it works is that the study tends to be reported in newspapers basically exactly when the study comes out. So that it's published is very, very close to when the study is released. So when you're looking at it, you can see if it's the right study, if it's around the right time period. So here I Googled it, and went down and found Stanford University website. And so the way that peer-reviewed studies tend to get publicized, and it's happened in my case, is that the university will write a press release, which will then go on their website. And then that press release will be picked up by news organizations. So I think this one here, I found the original press release, found where the paper was, and then voila, I found here, this is the original peer-reviewed study. And this here is the name of the journal. So here we go. Here's the name of the journal. I found the original article, which is great. I guess one issue is that you won't really be able to necessarily read the articles because a lot of them are behind a paywall. But you can get a fair amount of information from either like the abstract, the introduction to the paper, or from the press release from the university. So here we go, we found it. We could say, yeah, it's probably good science. Being a scientist, I'm not going to, there's no absolutes here, but it's probably reasonable science. But to remember, though, to check what the study actually says rather than what the news report says, because the news reporters are quite known for overly simplifying and misrepresenting some studies. So if you'll just make sure that what the news report said is what the study actually says. So voila, we got our peer-reviewed paper, excellent. But we want to make sure that we can trust it. So there has been, in the last few years, a bit of a epidemic, maybe, of fake journals. So these journals are ones that will basically publish anything if you pay them. So grad students and new career scientists are under a lot of pressure to publish. So they may publish in some of these journals. But this is relatively easy to find out. And these fake journals will pretend to be peer-reviewed, but a lot of scientists have demonstrated this isn't the case by submitting papers that just a complete gobbledygook and still get published in these fake journals. But a quick way to find out whether the journal is fake or a genuine journal is just to stick it into Wikipedia. If it's in Wikipedia and it says, gives you a little bit of information about the journal, you're fine. If it's a fake journal, it will either say that it's fake in Wikipedia or it won't be there at all. So yeah, there you go. So it's relatively easy to find out whether it's a genuine journal. But just some things that may go wrong with publishing. So as I said, graduate students and professors, there's a lot of pressure to publish papers. So it's basically publish or perish. When you're looking for your next job, really the primary thing that they're looking at is the number of papers you've published and in which journals you publish them in. So sometimes some things can maybe slip through the net that perhaps shouldn't. Also sometimes research funding sources. So researchers and professors at universities have to get their funding from somewhere. And sometimes they get them from sources that potentially might influence the papers. And also, there is also a big problem about getting the inability to get studies published if they have negative results. So if you've done a study and it shows that, it gives you some results that you can say A affects B, for example. But if you've done a study trying to find out if A affects B and you found out that A doesn't affect B, nobody will really publish it. Or it could be quite hard to get it published. So that's perhaps a little bit of a problem, that studies that demonstrate that there is an effect can sometimes be a little bit hard to publish. And also, to remember that science is a conversation. So a scientist will, will publish a paper, and then other scientists will read the paper, and if they disagree with it, then they'll publish another paper saying, I think your paper is wrong. So these individual papers are the way that scientists have conversations with each other, basically. So the way that scientists kind of somewhat not get around this, but is a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is basically a study of studies. So let's go back to the example before of where the red hair causes, red-headed individuals tend to be taller than non-red-headed individuals. So say we did this study and we found that red-headed individuals were taller than non-red-headed individuals, but other papers and other researchers across the world might do a similar study, and so there might actually be a lot of studies looking at this particular question. So what a meta-analysis does is it takes all of these different studies and looks at them and comes to a conclusion as to overall, taking all these studies into account, what the results overall are. So the meta-analysis is by far and away the best way, is the most reliable source for information. So if we think about that, health food, the organic food being healthier, if we had a meta-analysis looking at all the studies that looked at whether organic food was healthier or not any healthier than regular food, that meta-analysis it would be more reliable than each study by itself. So, and if you're looking at this when you're reading articles or news reports, they will say that it's a review of studies. So somewhere it might say that it's a review. So meta-analysis is brilliant. So let's get on to NGO or government reports. So there's, especially within climate change and environmental studies, NGO and government reports can matter quite a lot. So, but the first thing to note is that these reports are not peer-reviewed. So they might be quite good with their references and written very well, but they're not peer-reviewed. So let's have, as an example, look at this, the IPCC report from 2014, I think it is. So the first thing we want to look is, we have a report. So we want to look at who the authors are. We want to see how reliable we might think this report is. So you have a quick look. There's loads of authors. I just picked one at random. Chris Field, he is at Carnegie University. So he's an expert, we can say that. But the next question that we want to ask, and this is something that I guess non-scientists don't always think of asking, is that whether this expert is an expert in the particular topic that they're talking about. So the reason that this is pertinent is because, especially now with the advances in science for the past 100 years or so, there's a lot of science. So when individuals specialize, they specialize in a very, very, very small part. So, for example, I did my PhD and I specialized on a specific species of spider that live in Ecuador, and I spent 7 years studying these spiders. But it's not just that I specialized just in the spiders in general. I specialized in the behavior of these spiders. So I don't know anything really about their physiology, just their behavior. That's how specialized that you can get in science. So it's very important that when you're assessing whether someone can be a reliable source or not, whether their scientific speciality is relevant to what they're talking about. So with this one, the guy, this Chris Field, he is a climate scientist, so yes, we can say that this report, for example, is probably good science. So going back to who said it, so now we have just people. So here's an example that I got from the website US News. So it's claiming that a scientist said that carbon dioxide doesn't cause global warming. So the first thing I want to know is the person that said this scientist, is he or she actually an expert? So I had a bit of a Google, and I found this is actually his personal website. And it says that he did a Master of Science in Geology, but again, interestingly, I did click on this link, but it went to something completely irrelevant, nothing to do with his Masters. So we don't really know what his Masters was actually about. So just because he happened to have, just because he has a Masters, it depends on what it is and how long ago he earned his Masters as to how knowledgeable he is of the particular subject that he's talking about. So I would say probably, yep, he's not an expert. And in addition, you can't really see it here, but he was vice chairman of the American Oil and Gas Company, of an American oil and gas company. So he has an agenda. So this one, probably bad science. So here's another example. So this is where it gets important to think about what particular speciality the scientists may have. So this is one that's very recent. A physicist is claiming that global warming might be good for us. So is he or she an expert? In this case, he is an expert. He is a well-renowned physicist. Brilliant. But is this person an expert in the particular research field that he's talking about? So he is a physicist, and he specializes in atomic physics and optics. So no, he's not expert in climate change. So no, he's not an expert. So probably bad science. And so the last one is newspapers, websites, and others. So obviously, the thing to think about is what's the agenda of the website, newspaper, political party, or whatever that's saying it. So it's important to think about it from both a positive and negative perspective. So I've popped up something here from Greenpeace just to emphasize that even if you might actually agree with it, you might agree with the agenda, they still have an agenda for what they publish and what they talk about. So it's just something to bear in mind. So here we can go back to the 6 steps that you can work through to see whether or not it's likely to be good science or not. So first of all, step 1 is remember the biases. Think about whether the thing that you're looking at might be skewing your perception of what is the truth. Obviously, if it's important, don't bother about it. Go and have a beer, a cup of tea, do something else. Step 3, put the numbers in context. So is it a big number? Make sure that the number is, you think about it relative to what else is important. Step 4 is thinking about whether it is a correlation. 2 things are related and having to vary together. That does not mean that one causes the other one. Step 5, is it a prediction? So how they have obtained the prediction, bearing in mind that computer models probably the only reliable way of thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And obviously step 6, who actually said it, and how reliable and trustworthy as a scientific source are they. So basically this is my whole take-home message. This cat, just for everything, what? Is that likely to be true? Think carefully about what is and is not likely to be trustworthy. And so a little bit of further reading. Obviously, again, The Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, as well as Bad Science by Ben Goldacre. He has a fantastic book that talks about very similar things to what I've been talking about today. Also, podcasts. I have to admit, I do love a podcast. I'm listening to loads of podcasts, and they can be absolutely fantastic. So 3 maybe to get started on. More or Less Behind the Stats. So this one's fantastic. It just takes relevant news stories and really drills down into the numbers to find out whether they're likely to be true or false. And also I want to have a little bit of a thank you to one of the coordinators here, Stephanie Chong. She gave me a lot of advice on the presentation. The Ladies Learning Code. So they are a organisation that do classes for individuals to learn a bit of coding. So I went to one a couple of weeks ago. And they encouraged me to make the website and to think more carefully about the presentation as a whole. Terry over there, who's a fantastic volunteer. That's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, he's a fantastic volunteer. He's just makes these events possible. And yeah, if you want to contact me, here's some of my details. So I think that's it. So yeah, if anybody has any questions. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it does take time. So, yeah, it does take time. But if you want to read a very interesting book, and it's now a movie, Merchants of Doubt, it talks about how big industry, looking at tobacco, smoking, and now at climate change, have used the climate of doubt to delay any action on smoking and climate change. So yeah, you're right. Any other questions? Yep.
Very nice talk.
Thank you.
You say, or you indicate that the best source to get your information from is the original literature.
Yep.
Original studies, meta-analysis, peer review. But on the other side, for someone who's going to feel they're the ones who are full of technical terms and maybe not easy to understand data, do you think with more and more journals being open access that scientists should include the layman's summary?
That's really interesting, actually. So, yes, I agree, and I think it's not something that's been discussed very much before, but when I was submitting my PhD thesis a few months ago, I was surprised that they requested a lay summary. And so, yeah, I do think that would be really, really useful. And I also think that what would be useful too is a little bit more reward for scientists for doing outreach and communicating more with the public. So right now the way it works is there is no reward for an individual's career for taking some time to communicate and do science education and outreach. It just takes time away from their research and studies. So a little bit more incentive with funding agencies and universities to encourage more outreach. And that would be good as well, because I think scientists need to learn from the public what they know and don't know, just as much as the reverse. So yeah, I think lay summaries is actually a really good, it's something that should be done, but I think it might take quite a long time. But nevertheless, I think you can still read the papers and just, even if you don't understand everything, you could sometimes get a vague sense of what they're saying, what they're trying to communicate. You don't have to understand every word to understand the gist of what they're communicating, I think. Yes? So the question was about, for medical journals, highlighting who funded the research. And this is, there's a drive to doing that. And that is, I think, is a good thing. So I think this is an interesting subject because I believe, like, consciously, scientists are not aware that their research would necessarily be affected by who's funding the research. But I think on maybe more of a kind of a subconscious level, just because you know that if you come up with a study that goes against what the funding agency wants, to see that you might be less likely to receive further funding from them. And as with other studies, I think it's not quite such of a problem because there's not really a lot of industry, at least within my field. My field was evolution, ecology. There's no real industry that's funding studies, so the funding tends to come from governmental and NGO and non-profit funding agencies. But I can imagine that perhaps there's some funds from big oil or something like that that might go into funding. So yeah, I think that would... you can, with academic papers, you have to put at the bottom, there's a little section at the bottom where you have to say where your funding comes from, but unless you actually seek that out, you wouldn't know. Yeah, so I think, thinking about it more, highlighting it more is probably not a bad idea. I agree with that. Any other questions? I can't really see. Okay, well, no. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. I hope you've taken a little bit away from this, and so you maybe have a little bit more confidence when assessing the validity of news articles or anything that you might hear. So thank you very much.
Minds thinking, it's just by participating in some of these types of events.
Thank you.
Is this off now?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The mic. Oh, here he is, yeah.